The great ideas of the West, rationalism, self-criticism, the disinterested search for truth, the separation of church and state, the rule of law, equality before the law, freedom of conscience, thought and expression, human rights and liberal democracy, quite an achievement surely for any civilization, remain the best and perhaps the only means for all people, no matter what race or creed, to reach their full potential and live in freedom. That is why Western values, on which is self-evident economic, social, political, scientific, and cultural success is based, are clearly superior to any other devised by humankind. However, when these values have been adopted by other societies, similar benefits have accrued to its citizens, as in Japan and South Korea. Liberty, the second great panel in the triptych, is also an immense human idea. It is embodied in the magnificent creation of human rights. Human rights are, I believe, universal. They transcend local or ethnocentric values and confer equal dignity and value to all humanity, regardless of sex, ethnicity, sexual preferences, and religion. I also believe it is in the West that they are most respected. It is the West that has liberated women, racial minorities, religious minorities, gays and lesbians to an extent unimaginable 60 years ago. It is in the West that their rights are recognized and defended. In the West, we are free to think what we want, to read what we want, to practice our religion, to live lives of our own choosing. The notion of human rights and freedom were, I believe, there at the dawn of Western civilization, as ideals at least, and further developed during the Enlightenment, but are only now coming to fruition in the 21st century as a result of a series of supreme acts of self-criticism. Acts of self-criticism that led to greater freedom for a greater number of people. It was the West that took steps to abolish slavery. The calls for the abolition of slavery did not resonate in black Africa, where rival African tribes took black prisoners to be sold in the West. By contrast, stoning to death someone for adultery is a clear violation of the human rights of the individuals concerned. Punishments, laws concerning inheritance, and the rights of women prescribed by the Sharia Islamic law also flagrantly violate the human rights of individuals. Under Islamic law, women are not free to marry whom they wish. Homosexuals are killed, apostates are to be executed. The Quran is not a rights-respecting document. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness define succinctly the attractiveness and superiority of Western civilization. We are free in the West to choose. We have real choice to pursue our own desires. We are free to set the goals and contents of our own lives. The West is made up of individuals who are free to decide what meaning to give to their lives. In short, glory of the West is that life is an open book, while under Islam, life is a closed book. Everything has been decided for you. God and the Holy Law set limits on the possible agenda of your life. In many non-Western countries, especially Islamic ones, we are not free to read what we want. In Saudi Arabia, Muslims are not free to convert to Christianity, and Christians are not free to practice their faith. All clear violations of the Article 18th of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This desire for knowledge, no matter where it leads, inherited from the Greeks, has led to another institution that is unequal or very rarely equal outside the West, the university. Here, the outside world recognizes this superiority. It comes to the West to learn not only about sciences developed in the West in the last 500 years in all departments of physics, biology, and chemistry, but also of their own culture. They come to the West to learn of the Eastern civilization and languages. Easterners come to Oxford, Cambridge, or Harvard and Yale, the Sorbonne or Heidelberg, to receive their doctorates because they confer prestige unrivaled by similar doctorates from the third world countries. A culture that gave the world the spiritual creations of the classical music of Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner and Schubert, the paintings of Michelangelo and Raphael, Da Vinci and Rembrandt, does not need lessons from societies whose idea of spirituality is a heaven peopled with female virgins for the use of men, whose idea of heaven resembles a cosmic brothel. The West has given the world rather symphony and a novel even. To paraphrase Alan Kors, instead of the rigid, inhuman caste system in India, we have unparalleled social mobility in the West. Western society is a society of ever richer, more varied, more productive, more self-defined, and more satisfying lives. It is a society of boundless private charity. It is a society that broke, on behalf of merit, the seemingly eternal chains of station by birth. The West has given us the liberal miracle of individual rights, individual responsibility, merit, and human satisfaction. In contrast to the mind-numbing certainties and rules of Islam, Western civilization offers what Russell once called liberating doubt, which leads to the methodological principles of scientific skepticism. Politics, as much as science, proceeds by tentative steps of trial and error, open discussion, criticism, and self-correction. One could characterize the difference between the West and the rest as a difference in epistemological principles. Western institutions such as universities, research institutes, and libraries are, at least ideally, independent academies which enshrine these epistemological norms and where the pursuit of truth is conducted in a spirit of disinterested inquiry free from political pressures. In other words, behind the success of modern Western societies, with their science and technology and their open institution, lies a distinct way of looking at the world, interpreting it, and the recognition and rectifying of the problems besetting them. Problems are lifted out of the religious sphere and treated as empirical problems whose solutions lie in rational procedures open to rational intersubjective criticism, not in an appeal to revelation. The whole edifice of modern science and its methodology is one of the great Western man's greatest gifts to the world. But the West did not only give us just about every scientific discovery for the last 500 years, from electricity to computers, but gave us, thanks to its humanitarian impulses, the Red Cross, Doctors Without Frontiers or Borders, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International. It is the West that provides the bulk of the aid to beleaguered Darfur. Islamic countries are conspicuous by their absence. The West does not need lectures on the superior virtue of societies in which women are kept in subjection, endure genital mutilation, are stoned to death for alleged adultery, have acid thrown on their faces, are married off against their will at the age of 9, or where the human rights of those considered to belong to lower castes are denied. The West does not need sanctimonious homilies from societies that cannot provide clean drinking water for its citizens, that cannot provide sewage systems, that cannot educate its citizens, leaving 40 to 50% illiterate, that makes no provisions for the handicapped, from societies that have no sense of the common good, civic duty, civic responsibility, and civic accountability, from societies that are riddled with corruption. Moreover, the rest of the world recognizes the superiority of the West. It is to the West that millions of refugees from theocratic or totalitarian regimes flee, appreciating the West's tolerance and political freedom. Millions risk their lives trying to get to the West, not to Saudi Arabia or Iran or Pakistan. Second, no Western politician would be able to get away with the kind of racist remarks made by Mahathir, the Malaysian leader. No Western politician could survive in office. There would be calls for his or her resignation from third world leaders themselves, but also from Western media and other intellectuals. Yet we tolerate Mahathir's anti-Semitic diatribes. Double standards? Yes, but also a tacit acknowledgement that we expect higher ethical standards from the West. There are no jokes in Islam, as Khomeini once famously said. The West is able to look at its foibles and laugh, to make fun of its fundamental principles, but there is no equivalent as yet of Monty Python's Life of Brian. Can we look forward to the life of Mo, or half a Mo? Finally, when Chinese students cried and died for democracy in Tiananmen Square, they brought with them not representations of Confucius or Buddha, but a model of the Statue of Liberty. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ibn Warraq, for that, both for your eloquence and for your spectacular punctuality. You stopped on the second of your allotted 9 minutes, and I commend this practice to the other speakers. Charles, over to you.
After listening to that, I'm very glad to be a Westerner, Like George Nathaniel Curzon, I feel I am a very superior person as a result. And I assume that all of you who look to be mostly Western feel quite superior as well. And aren't we jolly lucky to be Western and so superior to those awful non-Western, Southern and Eastern people? Not just Muslims, but all of the deprived people who cannot share our values, who are not fortunate enough to have shared our values. And yet we have had a history of trying to share our values with them, which goes back a long way, not merely to the Crusades, but to the did everyone miss what I said before? It was brilliant. Because I am a Westerner, I'm very superior. Now, when Ferdinand Magellan arrived at Madras, beginning one of the first demonstrations of the robust assertion of Western values, he ordered the people of Madras immediately, on pain of being destroyed, to expel the Muslims and the Jews from the city. And the elders, who were Hindus, Muslims, and Jews, were rather puzzled by this because it had never occurred to them to expel the Muslims and the Jews from any city. They had never done it. Magellan gave them a warning and said when they came back a year later, if they didn't do it, the place would be destroyed. And indeed, he came back a year later, and they did destroy the city. And when they went in and they expelled and killed all of the Muslims and the Jews, they discovered that there was an ancient Christian sect there of Syriac Christians who had been converted to Christianity by St. Thomas the Apostle, a much older church than the Church of Portugal and Spain. They killed them too. They tried them at the Inquisition for heresy and killed them as well. So when we speak of our values, we don't just assert that our values are better, we ram them down the throats of the rest of the world. Now, in this discussion tonight, no one on our side is going to say that Eastern or Southern or whatever is a non-Western value is superior. We're merely calling upon you to think carefully what you mean when you say that your values or your race or your culture is superior to all others, not just Islam, but to all others in the world. We know what that leads to. And a culture, if there is such a thing as a cohesive Western culture, which gave the 20th century 2 world wars, in which nearly 100 million people died, in which 6 million people were sent to death camps, by the Germans and many more by the Russians. A culture which can do that really must be superior if it can point a finger at others and claim its moral superiority. And in the aftermath of that, the colonial wars that it fought, the French fought in Vietnam or killed 2 million people in Algeria, or the British who let 100,000 people die in Kenyan concentration camps, can point their finger. Or the Americans who killed 2 million Vietnamese between 1963 and 1972 can point their finger at the Vietnamese and claim moral superiority. Or those of us now, I'm a citizen of the United States, and by the way, I was born in California, much further west than any of you, so I must be even more superior. The CIA even today, torturing people at Abu Ghraib, at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, in Guantanamo, and in a number of undisclosed locations around the world, people taken away from their families and held and tortured for years on end. We have very superior values, and we have every right to assert those values in torture chambers, or in the helicopters from which we threw Viet Cong infrastructure, which meant you were a relation possibly of a Viet Cong member, from the helicopters into the South China Sea. Yes, we are very, very superior. When one asserts this notion, this ludicrous notion of racial or cultural or value superiority, one is really denying all of the cross-cultural wealth of our human legacy. We would throw out half of the poetry of Goethe, who was inspired by the Persian poet Hafiz. And then we would, not that anyone here would read Iqbal, but Iqbal, who was inspired by Goethe and wrote poems in honor of Goethe. This is a cross-culture, what Goethe himself called the East-West Diwan, where we could all sit together and exchange our cultures and exchange our values and exchange our ideas. If you go into that table to sit down to dinner with another man or another woman and say, I am superior, you don't have a dialogue. You replace discourse with discord. You replace jaw with war. You don't have a chance of enriching even yourself And if you assert that superiority, you're basically abandoning any hope of being even an equal. So I would call on you to bear this in mind when you're conscientiously casting your vote as good, superior Western people. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. The contributions are getting shorter and shorter. I'm not sure this is going to turn into a trend, but we'll see. David Oronovich, you have 9 minutes if you choose to take it.
They were getting shorter. But I'm sure nobody will mind, least of all Charles, if I take up his extra minute that he laid down and so on. No, maybe not. I mean, first can I say that this is easily the most distinguished set of opponents I've ever had in a debate of this kind, and I have debated against Boris Johnson. So, distinguished writers, distinguished journalists, and a distinguished professor, and all of whom I consider to be people who are people who one can have a dialogue with, a discourse with, and not in any sense enemies. But of course, when kind of considering how this debate was likely to go, I did think that however wonderful they were, the first thing we'd attempt to do would be to throw a kind of fog of obscurantism over the course of this debate, because actually we know what this discussion is really about. It's not about whether or not we think Western people are superior to Eastern people. It's not about race. It's not about literature. It is about cultural relativism. That's what this discussion is essentially about. Western values, as we understand them, not just practiced in the West, practiced in a large number of places, but usually called Western values, are precisely the ones that Ibn Warraq laid out. And we know what they are. They are liberal democracy. They are a culture of human rights. They are, and this is very important, freedom of expression. They are freedom of worship, and they are secular government as a consequence of those previous things. They are freedoms to, and they are freedoms from. The fact that the West may often fall short of its own ideals, of its own values, if you like, is testified in the very fact that something like Abu Ghraib, which was mentioned there by Charles, is regarded by us as a blot on our name rather than as a matter of good policy by the government that implemented it, as it would have been by the government of Saddam Hussein, who had Abu Ghraib before the Americans got there. Yeah. This is an important distinction, even if it feels less so, possibly, to the person who's actually at the end of the torture. I completely accept that. Now, I agree, obviously, that Western values, as I've just outlined them, can be practiced in many countries. They're practiced, for instance, in the liberal democracy in India. In Japan, as a consequence largely of the constitution imposed upon the Japanese but accepted by them by the United States after the end of the Second World War. It's practiced in South Korea. It's practiced in many places in Southeast Asia now. It is increasingly practiced around the world, increasingly because it is very much more prevalent than it was. So I want to look at one place, just for the moment, at which we can see, if you like, what a different set of cultural standards can lead you to, and that is the Islamic Republic of Iran. On the 15th of August 2004, a 16-year-old girl called Atefe Sahala was hanged in a public square in the Iranian city of Neka, and her death sentence was imposed, and this is the quote, for crimes against chastity. Her father was a drug addict. Her mother had died when she was 4. She had been arrested by the police for attending a party and for being alone in a car with a boy. She received her first sentence for crimes against chastity when she was just 13, which also involved getting 100 lashes while in prison. She then, she says, was raped by a former Revolutionary Guard who was 51. When she was tried for this and found guilty, he was found guilty too. He was sentenced to 95 lashes, and she was hanged. She was hanged. The man who put the noose around her neck was the judge who had sentenced her in the first place. Maryam Ayubi, in her early 30s, around about the same time, was put to death at dawn in Tehran's Evin prison. She was washed, wrapped in a white shroud, carried on a stretcher to an open space. There, she was placed in a hole, and earth was compacted around her, and so on, and she was stoned to death, not for the murder of her husband, which she was found guilty for with somebody else, but for the crime of adultery. In May of that same year, a woman who had been waiting on death row for 8 years was stoned for corruption on earth. She'd been found guilty of taking part in a pornographic film, and her execution at that point was the first stoning for several years. And just in case you think the practice has died out, in July this year, the Iranian government confirmed that a man was executed by stoning in a small village near Takistan. The villagers said the sentence was carried out by the local judge and authorities. At the same time, it confirmed that 20 other men were to be given capital punishment for crimes ranging from adultery to immoral behaviour to crimes against religion to sodomy, which is almost certainly a euphemism for homosexuality, which is odd, because we now know from President Ahmadinejad in his visit to Columbia University that there are no homosexuals in Iran. In the law of the Islamic Republic of Iraq, the father, in a case where people split up, automatically, without appeal, gets custody of a boy over 2 years or of a girl over 7. In the court of law, 2 women witnesses are the equal of 1 male. And I could go on and so on. This is not some kind of loose notion of how things should be done. It's not some arbitrary, it's not an Abu Ghraib, it's not some kind of strange move away from the jurisdiction, from the jurisprudential aspects of what Iran does. That's their policy. Now, the reason why, you may say, okay, this is an extreme example, one of the most extreme examples, and that's where I want to take you to the agony, what I consider to be the agony of Professor Tariq Ramadan here, who I consider to be a good man, a very good man. In a debate in 2003 with the now President Nicolas Sarkozy, Tariq Ramadan was waylaid by Sarkozy's debating style. He's not a bad debater, Sarkozy, and he was effectively ambushed. And he was asked what he thought about the practice of stoning. And you replied, Tariq, that you favoured a moratorium on such practices, but you refused to condemn the law outright. Sarkozy said, I quote, "A moratorium, that is to say we should for a while hold back from stoning women?" And you said, no, wait. What does a moratorium mean? A moratorium would mean that we absolutely end the application of all of those penalties in order to have a true debate. And my position is that if we arrive at a consensus among Muslims, it will necessarily end. But you cannot, when you're in a community, today on television, I can please the French people who are watching by saying, my own position, but my own position doesn't count. What matters is to bring about an evolution in Muslim mentalities, Mr. Sarkozy. And Sarkozy, you can imagine him kind of getting off on this, that's monstrous to stone a woman because she's an adulterer. It's necessary to condemn it. And you said, Tariq, Mr. Sarkozy, listen to what I'm saying. When I say my own position is the law's not applicable, that's clear. But today, I speak to Muslims around the world, and I take part, even in the United States, in the Muslim world. You should have a pedagogical posture that makes people discuss things. You can decide all by yourself to be a progressive in the communities. That's too easy. Today, my position is that to say we should... Today, my position is that is to say we should stop. Tariq, what were you saying? What were you saying? I think you were saying that you would lose your audience if you told them that stoning was wrong, that they would somehow be detached from you if you were to say to them outright, look, folks, stoning women is wrong. It is a value I cannot uphold. It is one that I totally and absolutely abhor. It cannot exist in a civilized society. But you could not say that to them because that could not be part of your discourse. You then went to say, Ian Baruma, the author, when he interviewed you on the subject, but when you want to be heard in Muslim countries, you said, when you're addressing religious issues, you can't just say it has to stop. I think it has to stop, but you have to discuss it within the religious context. There are texts involved. I'm not just talking to Muslims in Europe, but addressing the implementation of hudud everywhere in Indonesia, Pakistan, and the Middle East. That is precisely the point, Tariq. Now, are women to enjoy rights equal to those... Are women to enjoy rights equal to those of men? Are adults to decide which other adults they have sex with, or is that a cultural tick? And my final point is this. My father was a member of the Communist Party, and he believed for a while that Stalin was indeed a mighty man. And there were around at that time many people who would say that the West was in some way inferior or not superior. The values of the West America were not superior to those properly understood in the Soviet Union if you only just understood the context. You have to learn, I think, Tariq. Your father was very close to Hassan al-Banna and so on, the Muslim Brotherhood. You have to learn at some point to say, no, actually, I'm not going along with that anymore. These values of human rights, these values of liberty and so on are superior, and I will support them.